Morning everybody and welcome to this Valentine's Day episode of the Housing, Planning and Environment Overview and Scrutiny Committee. Apologies, first of all, item 1. We've had apologies from councillors Laura Booth, Catherine Preston, Graham Whitton, Michael Winstanley, Lynn Holland and Shamim Abdullah. We have substitutes here, Councillor Fred Walker and Councillor Tanya Birch. Thank you very much for subbing and making us wonderfully quorate. So thank you very much for that. Item 2, Chair's announcements and urgent business. I would like to welcome Councillor Ben Clay from Manchester City Council, who is here as a new member of this committee because Councillor James Wilson has stepped down. And Councillor Barbara Brownridge, who is joining us from Oldham. Councillor Brownridge is here because Councillor Steve Bashforth has stepped down. Julie, you were going to say a brief word about some of the papers, please.
Yeah, just some apologies. We've recently launched a new website. The meetings page with the meetings papers on hasn't been refreshed because we're getting modern.gov in April time. So we had a few technical hitches getting the links to you this time, so apologies for that, but hopefully you've been able to access all the reports, many of which were circulated last month anyway, so you should have had quite a lot of time to read the documents.
Thank you very much for that. So we look forward to modern.gov entering our lives for the combined authority as well as for our local boroughs. Okay, item 3, are there any declarations of interest for any of the items on the agenda? No? Okay. Item 4, minutes of the last meeting. Any comments on those minutes? Councillor Gunther, can you use your microphone, please?
Lisa. Yeah. Can you just come on to the minute 124/HPE, and it's relating to housing, and it just says right. Although it was a commitment of the elected mayor to get rid of rough sleepers, I think it's now appears to have become an aspiration. And what it's saying here, the mayor stated that he had been advised that ending rough sleeping as an absolute is a technology. Is technically not possible due to a number of factors, such as some rough sleepers not accepting available held support and so on. In other words, rough sleepers don't want to go into that kind of accommodation. What I'm suggesting is it's nearly all dormitory accommodation. Would it not be better to provide less in the form of cubicle accommodation and try to accommodate some rough sleepers that are prepared to go that route?
Can I ask Councillor Gunther, do you agree that these minutes are accurate?
I'm sorry, yes, Chair, I do.
Okay.
So that's where we are.
What I propose, because I think it's a valid point that you raise, although I think the Mayor's election pledge was to eradicate rough sleeping rather than the people who are rough sleeping. I don't think he was...
Well, I don't know if there's a difference there.
Although I may have misread, but my understanding was it was the rough sleeping. But I think there's space on our agenda later on for you to raise points about homelessness, rough sleeping and all of that. I think it's a valid point. Does anybody have a comment on the minutes? No. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. Is it your wish that they are agreed as a true record of the last meeting? Right. Thank you very much indeed. Okay. We've got 2 substantial items on our agenda today. We've got the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework and the Transport 2040 Delivery Plan. These are big, chunky items that have been before us in various stages as a committee before. Because they interlink so much, it's my proposal that we hear from both sets of presenters and then take questions as a whole. Because I don't want to say, well, let's wait to talk about transport infrastructure to the later item when we're talking about the GMSF. Are members comfortable with that? So hearing from our presenters and then we ask questions. And then we've got really good time to get into some of the nitty-gritty about that. Lovely. So our first presentation is going to be from the team working on Greater Manchester Spatial Framework. We've got Simon Noakes, Paul Dennett and Anne Morgan who are here. Welcome. all familiar faces to this committee. Please, just assume we've read every word of the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework. No. I understand that you'd like to make some opening remarks, which I think would be really helpful. So please take up to maybe 10 minutes or so, and then we'll come on to transport, and then we'll have plenty of questions, I'm sure. Please go ahead.
Okay, I'll kick off if that's okay. So as colleagues know, we've recently gone out to consult on the revised Greater Manchester Spatial Framework, or what I like to call it, the Greater Manchester Plan for Homes, Jobs and the Environment, because I think it's really important we acknowledge this isn't just about allocating space. This is actually a strategy and a plan for, you know, the next 20 years, in a sense, within Greater Manchester, and it's about how we move forward with our vision for this city region. Just to be clear, at the moment, this is being pursued as a joint development plan document between the 10 local authorities within the city region. At the moment, we're still waiting for changes to statutory instruments and obviously parliamentary time to be allotted to consider whether or not we will be pursuing a spatial development strategy. We're hopeful that we'll know probably around March, April time, but at the moment, as it stands, this is currently being pursued as a joint development plan document between the 10 local authorities. As colleagues know, back in 2016, we received over 27,000 responses to the initial consultation on the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework. And the public were very clear with us, weren't they? They said, we want infrastructure, and infrastructure is about schools, doctors' surgeries, dentists, roads, public transport, integrated public transport. And they're also clear about the importance of green space and green infrastructure, if you like, across the city region. And I believe what we've done since, obviously, the election of Andy Burnham and the challenge to undertake a radical redraft of the spatial framework is exactly that. So moving into some of the policy content within the spatial framework, colleagues will know that what we've now done is we've set ourselves an affordable housing target over the period of the plan of 50,000 homes. 30,000 of those will be social homes as well, acknowledging that there are issues there with regards to what is affordable housing and what constitutes affordable housing. Current definition of that is 80% of market value, and that's enshrined in government policy. But we know that markets have continued to rise exponentially, whereas wages have stagnated really over the last couple of decades. So home ownership, increasingly as a consequence of that, becomes unaffordable for a lot of people. There's clear problems there in terms of linking affordability with what people actually earn rather than how the market changes or markets change over time, because we have multiple housing markets. Even within Greater Manchester, we have multiple housing markets. In addition to that, there is a commitment within the draft spatial framework to carbon neutrality for the city region for Greater Manchester by 2038. There's also a commitment to new homes being net zero carbon by 2028, so significantly contributing to some of the work that's been undertaken already through the Green Summit and the work that Councillor Gnotis has kind of forged ahead within Greater Manchester. There's a clear relationship, is what I'm trying to say here, between all of that and what we're trying to do through the draft spatial framework. In addition to that, you'll be aware that there is a planning presumption contained in this document against fracking for Greater Manchester, which obviously demonstrates, I think, that we've listened to the public of Greater Manchester who have real concerns about the consequences of fracking. And we also know just down the road what that actually means in Blackpool, where, you know, fracking has had to have been stopped because of earthquakes and tremors within that area of the country. In addition to that, we have a brownfield preference throughout all of this. And that builds on, in many respects, Andy Burnham's commitment through the Town Centre Challenge to think about how we reconceptualise our town centres. And we know nationally town centres and high streets are struggling for a whole host of reasons. Retail is struggling because of online shopping, because of large supermarket stores now being the norm almost in terms of consumer behaviour. So Andy's challenge is how can we get more urban density, more housing into our town centres and reconceptualise that around culture, leisure, sporting activities, walking, cycling, public realm, all of that sort of stuff is going on. And Stockport in many respects is leading the way with some of this through the exploration of a mayoral development corporation. So using some of the powers that have been afforded to the combined authority and looking at how we deliver on the challenge around town centre regeneration. In addition to that, you'll be aware that there is a more than 50% reduction from the previous draft GMSF in terms of greenbelt take for the purposes of development within the spatial framework. And alongside that, there are also stronger protections for non-greenbelt land, because what we've been trying to do is look at where are those spaces, those pieces of land where there's huge public utility to try and drive an agenda of further stronger protections for parts of Greater Manchester. We finally have clarity on our local housing need in that the government have obviously consulted and they've been quite clear in their consultation and told us that we are to use the 2014 Office for National Statistics population projections and housing projections. So it's clear now what our local housing need is over the period of the plan, and that is 201,000. There's an 8.6% buffer in there as well, which takes that figure up to around 218,000. So clarity on the housing numbers has been something obviously we've been pushing for and campaigning for and certainly lobbying the government for, and we seem to have that. Although the government hasn't formally responded at this stage to their own actual consultation. So we're still waiting for that formal consultation response, but we don't envisage that there'll be any significant change because government have already said in the consultation that local authorities, city regions should be using the 2014 data. I think in addition to that, one thing I wanted to just tease out is the importance of actually having a city regional plan for homes, jobs and the environment. This is how we achieve inclusive growth, because we know growth has often been very much southern-centric within the city region over the last decade or so. Also, we can all benefit from urban density. We know Manchester, Salford and parts of Trafford, for example, at the moment tend to be building higher density homes. So in delivering our local housing need, our housing number, if we collaborate around this agenda, we can all benefit from that urban density at the urban core, which will help us all to potentially reduce greenbelt take in meeting our housing need numbers. I think there's also a really important point as well, and that is we already know within the city region we have developers who are challenging our ability to deliver on our 5-year land supply in certain districts. So by collaborating around all of this, what I think is a really big advantage is that we overcome doing planning by appeal, which, as I'm sure colleagues in the room know, can be exceptionally costly in terms of challenging developers and going through the whole appeals process. I know in Salford at the moment we're currently going through a third appeal on a site which a developer is challenging. So, you know, overcoming those challenges through collaboration is really, really important, because if we collaborate around the 5-year land supply and also the delivery challenges, because we've got to demonstrate delivery as part of that, I think it puts us in a much stronger place in terms of forthcoming development. What I would say as well is please don't consider this draft GMSF in isolation. This is to be considered alongside the housing vision, which, as you know, is a precursor to a housing strategy for Greater Manchester. And also, I can see you've got on the agenda the infrastructure framework for 2040, which again is a precursor for us having a much more strategic approach to infrastructure within Greater Manchester, building on some of the work of the National Infrastructure Commission in terms of those themes around energy, transport, digital, flooding, surface and waste water management, green and blue infrastructure, and drinking water as well. All of these things are very much part of our thinking. So I guess what I'm encouraging you not to do is consider this in isolation, because it is part of a suite of documents which is about proper, robust strategic planning for Greater Manchester, certainly over the next 20 years up until 2040. Colleagues will be familiar, and I'll end on this in terms of the consultation. On the 6th of January, the agenda and papers were published. There was a Gmca, a combined authority meeting on the 11th of January. On the 14th of January, the consultation portal opened online, and then the formal consultation started on the 21st. So papers were available for the public to consider and look at before the actual formal consultation started on the 21st of January. And that runs for 8 weeks, and that will close on the 18th of March. So I think I'll end there in terms of introducing. I don't know if colleagues want to say anything further.
I guess just very briefly, just wanted to obviously Paul's talked about the combined authority meeting in the middle of January, and the future of Greater Manchester paper that tries to wrap all of these things together to see that in the context of the overall Greater Manchester strategy, which obviously talks about our people and our place. Just obviously a lot of activity going on the people side of the equation at the moment around things like the cultural strategy, public service reform, the life readiness work that we're doing, but also just to mention activity that's going on in the local industrial strategy that we're producing, which is effectively where's Greater Manchester going to earn its keep, if you like, over the next 20 years or so, as part of work going on nationally about industrial strategies. We're a trailblazer for how Greater Manchester's going to produce a local industrial strategy, and that really picks up on some of our economic strengths that a lot of this infrastructure and spatial planning needs to kind of play to. So particularly around our strengths on digital, around our strengths on advanced materials and advanced manufacturing, around low carbon and how we move forward on that, and around health and care innovation. So actually the economic side of the equation being looked at by obviously a different scrutiny committee, but the economic side of the equation through the local industrial strategy and the people agenda are all absolutely fundamental to the kind of infrastructure and spatial planning work that this agenda is talking about.
Anne?
Just very quickly, I had a 31-slide presentation for you, which is on screen. I think Paul has actually very succinctly presented that to you, so I'll not intend to go through it now. I know you've all read it in detail. That's great, and I'll just wait for your questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you all. Okay. That was our first course. Moving on now to the cherry on the top or something. I don't know quite what. Simon is here to talk to us about Transport 2040 delivery plan. Again, 10 minutes or so, please.
Thank you, Chair. So members will recall that when the consultation was last undertaken on GMSF, one of the dominant features that came back through the consultation were transport issues, and to a degree sort of transport issues from two principal perspectives. Firstly, within the volume of consultation responses, I think somewhere in the order of about 9 out of 10 consultation responses made reference to connectivity and transport issues in expressing views on particular locations. And strategically, I think a general question came back around the relationship between GMSF and the 2040 transport strategy, which of course have been published at a similar time. And so working with Simon and working with Anne's team, what we've looked to do over the past 18 months is to really kind of tackle those issues and to ensure that what we can show is a completely integrated relationship between where we're looking to take transport policy in Greater Manchester and where we're looking to take spatial planning in Greater Manchester as part of that overall approach that Paul's just described at an overall city-region level. That process, I've come to the committee in the past and described how we developed a series of study areas across Greater Manchester, understanding all of the network level issues associated with the spatial framework. I'll come back to site-specific issues, but network level issues, so that we could set out a plan at a network level at this stage that is able to give confidence that we understand the challenges that growth inevitably brings to a transport system and how we can address those challenges over time. And all of that work now culminates in the draft delivery plan, which we've published as part of the suite of documents alongside the spatial framework for consultation, so that we can specifically address to a transport audience how we respond to the challenge of growth. The reason why I emphasise that this is a network level strategy at this stage is there is further work to follow on the back of the delivery plan that we've set out here. So we recognise that as we move forward to the final stages of publication, examination in public, and so on and so forth around the spatial framework, that we then need to be able to drill these policies down into very specific site level access issues. As the consultation around the spatial framework then allows the local authorities to firm up final proposals in terms of land allocations, so that work will follow. Only as we have a steady state in terms of the spatial framework can we get to the detailed movement modelling that's ultimately needed around each individual site, so that we can start to set out specific site level transport plans. So that is not the intention of the delivery plan. The intention of the delivery plan is to deal with the strategic issues at a network level. So what have we looked to describe here in the delivery plan? Well, firstly, we've looked to be very clear in terms of what we understand to be the scale of growth over time from a travel perspective. So if we assume that people continue to travel according to growth in the way that they have done, then the level of growth described in the spatial framework over time will equate to somewhere in the order of a further 800,000 daily trips around our transport system. And the challenge that we have set of our delivery plan and our overall policy framework is that as that growth takes place, so we also move to a situation where 50% of journeys undertaken around Greater Manchester are undertaken by a mode other than car. On the face of it, that sounds like a big shift, but let's not lose sight of the fact that half of the journeys that we make within Greater Manchester are very short journeys, 0 to 2 kilometre journeys, and 40% of those journeys at the moment we make by car. So actually there's an awful long way to go in terms of us being able to address local neighbourhood movements and really start to tackle a number of the ways in which we travel very locally and actually at present don't necessarily make best use of the networks that we have out there. What we've then done within the delivery plan is to describe specifically those investment schemes and those policy initiatives that we believe need to come forward over time in order to ensure that we can continue to provide the best possible offer for travel alternatives across Greater Manchester. And we've set that out longhand for those people who like to read things longhand. But what we've also done is we've set them out very clearly on 3 maps in the documentation. So the first map in the documentation describes the activity already underway between now and the early 2020s to improve the transport system in Greater Manchester, from the opening of the Trafford Park Metrolink line, which we'll see in 2020, through to the investment programme that's underway through the growth deal, the cycling programme and Metrolink capacity programme that's underway through Transforming Cities Fund, and also the parallel investment that's underway through the wider transport industry, the investment that's underway through the rail industry, and the investment that's underway from Highways England in the motorway system. We then move on to the second map, and the second map sets out the additional initiatives that we want to be able to deliver by the mid-2020s. in Greater Manchester, and they are now the priority in terms of immediate investment cases that we are looking to put to government through discussions around new funding models that are taking place through the local industrial strategy process that Simon described before. And on the third map, we set out the longer term, large scale investment schemes that we are now starting to develop the investment case for. And the single largest entity within that is our approach of looking to move towards a tram train metro style rail network across Greater Manchester, starting to make use of the additional capacity that we've already now delivered within the regional centre, ultimately bolstering that capacity further, and then allowing more of the local rail services to run on to that network over time, so that we can make both best use of central Manchester and Salford capacity, but we can also start to offer the types of benefits in terms of journey frequencies that we see on the Metrolink system across more parts of the rail system. At the end of the document, we discuss the realities that as yet we do not have a funding arrangement in place to be able to deliver against the delivery plan. This is a core component of the conversation with government through the local industrial strategy. Where we have been successful as Greater Manchester is being innovative around funding. The fact that we have delivered the network that we've delivered in recent years has been because we were on the front foot in terms of a funding debate with government in creating the Greater Manchester Transport Fund. And the conversation now with government through the local industrial strategy is how we now start to establish a second transport funding arrangement for Greater Manchester. The National Infrastructure Commission gave very good advice to government last summer around a devolved cities model, and in effect what that said was that there is a way of building on the type of partnership model that we've established in Greater Manchester for those places that have a coherent transport plan. That's what we're setting out here, that sits alongside a coherent housing plan, which of course is what we're setting out in the spatial framework. So all of the right conditions are in place for us to be able to establish that deal, but we will need the support of all of our partners across Greater Manchester in working with government through the spending review process to make that a reality. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed. Big topics to cover. I'll start with a point of clarification, I think. Probably Anne's the right person for me to ask this. It's about the numbers, for the housing numbers. Yeah. So government has said use 2014. This is a plan for 20 years or so. How fixed are those numbers, and how nimble might we as Greater Manchester need to be in 5 years, 10 years time?
In terms of how fixed they are, they're not that fixed at the moment because government hasn't responded to the consultation, although we believe that is going to come in imminently. If, as a result of that, they change the methodology, we would look to review that for the next stage of the plan. But that's something that clearly we would have to do. I would be very surprised if that is what they're saying, but they are saying they're looking to review it probably in 2 years' time when the new household and population projections come out in 2020. So we will be we'll need to look and see where we're at in our process. I think we'd be about at the stage of submission, and at that point we'd have to take a decision. Are we going to submit on the current figures, or we're going to look at the methodology? I think at this stage we would be saying we want to get to submission as quickly as possible because we want a plan in place as quickly as possible. But we always have to be ready, which is why we've had the delay this time, that suddenly something happens and we have to review whether or not we go ahead on the basis of current figures, whether or not we wait for the methodology. So I think it will be something that we are constantly speaking to you about where the housing numbers sit. I think once we've submitted, then government is saying the figures you've used, you won't be able to be challenged on if something new happens once you've submitted. They will hold for the duration of an examination. So our decision is about when we submit, I think. So we'll wait for the outcome of this consultation with quite a lot of interest. If it says what we expected to say, then I think we need to be having the discussions about with government about what a new methodology might look like before it comes out in 2020, just so we have an idea of whether that's going to be significantly different or not.
That's helpful, thank you. Okay, Councillor Morgan, please.
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, obviously, Bolton welcomes the revised GMSF on the grounds that it's less reliant on greenbelt. We've significantly lost a lot of proposed allocated greenbelt, so I welcome that. There's just something Paul said. We in Bolton, as he touched on, we're getting hammered at the moment by developers using the excuse that we don't have that 5-year housing supply identified. Are we saying, as a combined authority, as the 10 authorities, if we come up across the 10 with the numbers to allocate for our 5-year plan, say, I'm not saying, say Bolton can't beat it and Oldham can take up another 1,000, are we saying if we can demonstrate across the patch that we can meet the housing plan, that we could use that with regards to planning to try and protect our green belt? And the other thing, a slight concern, is with regards to the Greater Manchester declared statement saying we're anti-fracking. How does that stand with regards to predetermination on planning at each individual local authority? And would it not allow applicants to use that as, well, you were predetermined before we came with any application in fracking? And on the transport side of things, there's an indication of free bus travel for 16 to 18 years old. And in light of the recent LGA announcement stating that there's a funding gap between government grant and the free pensioner travel, how's it going to be funded? And finally, Bolton-centric, as ever, there's an indication that we're going to look at Metrolink for Bolton, but it is only a commitment for feasibility study rather than any commitment moving forward. So obviously we in Bolton would like a bit more of a commitment to our chums. Thank you.
So there's a lot on there. I think if I could just add to Councillor Morgan's final point of about 12 that he had in there, was maybe some explanation taking Bolton out of it, perhaps, although he's made his point. How a project gets from map 3 of we'll have some options to map 2, we'll have a feasibility study, to map 1, which is we'll deliver. That would be interesting, I think, for us to understand. But there was a lot to go at, so whoever wants to go first, go ahead.
I think Anne's going to respond on the technicalities of the 5-year land supply. On predetermination, there's no doubt that what we've put into the draft GMSF is at odds with the National Planning Policy Framework. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens at public examination in terms of how the presumption against fracking is actually dealt with regards to the spatial plan. And we've been clear about that, and I know there's been journal articles and things in The Guardian, I think, that Andy's been questioned on exactly this. So for me, this will all be dealt with at public examination, and we'll see what happens with regards to whether or not the presumption against fracking is, holds within the spatial framework draft. And if it does, then it becomes something we all, as local authorities, need to take decisions in line with. So that will be the status of it. But I guess I can't tell you what the outcome of that is going to be until it goes before public examination at this stage. But on the 5-year land supply, I think Anne's probably best placed to answer the technicalities around how this will work.
I can try. We did talk, and we've probably talked at this committee about whether or not we could have a Greater Manchester 5-year land supply. What we've come up with in this plan in table 7.2, which I'm sure you've all looked at, is the phasing of new housing. So what we have done is look at the land supply districts have in the overall land supply, how quickly you think that will come forward, and we have phased against that. So in the earlier years, we're actually saying Manchester and Salford will be probably delivering more of Greater Manchester's housing than in the later years, because some districts will take longer for their sites to come forward. So Bolton have a lower target in the early years of 520, which moves up to 800 in the later years, because your site should be coming on track. So the whole purpose of doing this is to give and to ensure that every district has a 5-year land supply, so that applications that come in that aren't in line with your policy you can resist, which at the moment I know you're having particular problems with. So we've phased it linked to land supply and linked to deliverability, and you can see that there are slightly different numbers for each district for the first 5 years and then for the next 5 or 10 years of the plan.
Transport. So the observation of the LGA around the funding gap on national concessionary travel is a real issue. It's a real issue that collectively as a sector we have been aware of for quite some time, and because we are able to act in the way that we can as Greater Manchester collectively as a conurbation through ourselves as TFGM, we've been building that expectation into the medium-term financial strategy that sits behind the transport levy for a number of years now. So Greater Manchester has a strategy to deal with that, despite the fact that it is a reality. Of course, it means that we then have to take difficult decisions across the transport budget in balancing the levy. But it is something that consistently the Combined Authority has committed to, and of course as Greater Manchester we do go further than the national minimum. The national minimum is to provide free off-peak travel on bus services within a given travel area. We also extend that for Greater Manchester residents who are eligible to local rail and local Metrolink travel. The fact that we have a robust medium-term financial strategy then allows the Mayor to have a conversation with leaders through the discussion around the transport budget in terms of looking to extend the arrangements through to 16 to 18-year-olds, where working with the Mayor, we have been assessing and identifying that there is a cogent case for that new cohort of learners who require ever greater mobility around the conurbation in order to access the very best post-16 education. As post-16 education becomes more and more around apprenticeships, more and more around flexible part working, part learning models, offering the ability for better mobility for that group of young people around the conurbation, means that affordability doesn't then become an issue in terms of that age group taking up the best education opportunities. With regard to light rail schemes, so we have developed in partnership with colleagues in local authorities what we call a transport pipeline process, which will then enable us to track all of the initiatives that we've set out within the delivery plan through a series of stages. The complexity of those stages grows depending on the scale of the initiative, and light rail schemes, as you would imagine, are at the far end in terms of complexity and scale in that regard. If we look at the Trafford Park line alone, the Trafford Park line is £350 million piece of transport investment. The core stages of bringing forward a transport scheme of that stage, of that scale, well, firstly, we start with feasibility studies. That's the work that's now really underway, signalled by the delivery plan. What that allows us to do is to revisit and understand the scale of travel demand that we anticipate through a corridor over time, not just based on the travel that we see at the moment, but our understanding in terms of changing travel patterns, growth in housing markets, changing employment markets, and so on and so forth. We then weigh that understanding of travel demand up against a series of options, from low-cost options to higher-cost options, and that allows us to start to form the basis of a benefit-to-cost ratio, and so we can start to take some decisions in terms of the relative transport merits between different elements. But of course, that's not the only element that's under consideration in Greater Manchester. In the same way as we did with the first Transport Fund, we'll also weigh those initiatives up against the wider economic rebalancing, regeneration, social inclusion, and also environmental sustainability objectives that the City Region has set through the Greater Manchester Strategy. That then allows us to bring our initial analysis back to the Combined Authority and have a conversation against, hopefully by then, a slightly better understanding of the funding window around relative priorities. From that, we can determine which schemes are we then going to put some further money into to develop business cases for those schemes. The business case then allows us to secure the funding. Once we've secured the funding, we can then secure the necessary Transport and Works Act powers that are needed to deliver a transport scheme of that level. So there are a series of land acquisitions and so on and so forth that are, and various transport powers that are required to deliver a scheme of that level and that complexity. The Transport and Works Act gives us an order process where we can bundle all of those issues into one parliamentary order process. From start to finish, across the programme that we've just delivered in terms of Metrolink, is somewhere in the order of 8 to 10 years, depending particularly on the ability of us to be able to find a good window for the Transport and Works Act order process, which is no mean feat within itself. So that's the process that we'll be taking ourselves through, and the kind of time frame that we're looking at.
I should have, when I opened up, I should have given the Mayor of Greater Manchester's apologies. He had hoped to be here but is in London at a meeting of mayors. I don't know what the collective noun is for mayors. Maybe you know, or I don't know. But he's at a meeting of mayors and... okay. He's at a meeting of mayors, and there's also a clean air meeting as well, which he's at. So he's not here because, of course, members will know that transport is his portfolio at the Combined Authority. Okay, I have Councillor Birch, and then Councillor Gunther, Councillor Walker, and then Councillor Sharp. Councillor Birch, please.
Thank you, Chair. You might be glad to know I've got only 1.5 points. So point one, Greater Manchester Spatial Framework now includes a new policy commitment to deliver 50,000 affordable homes, and 30,000 of them are supposed to be social housing. Because I sit on planning, that strikes a chord in my heart. Of course, affordable housing doesn't mean possibly what it used to mean or supposed to mean. And if a multimillionaire can afford half a million apartment on the Keys, that's not affordable housing. And of course, we hear these stories that developers come into the area, and as long as they can prove that they can't build any social housing, they, quite often, it is a battle. Quite often they are allowed not to have either very reduced numbers or not provide any affordable social housing. I was just wondering, I mean, we have got Combined Authority as committed to put 300 million pounds toward it. So we put our money where our mouth is. That's fantastic. It's not just a rhetoric. I was wondering, I know it's a bit, I'm trying to get into details. We might not be able to provide them at the moment. But I was wondering if we have any mechanism, any systems, any structures just to make sure to separate that affordable housing and social housing and spend some of that money on specifically social housing. Do we have any system, structures, mechanisms to ensure that's what happens? Thank you.
Thank you for the difficult question, Councillor Birch. This is a complex area, as I'm sure you're aware, and although we've got a target in here, I'm acutely aware that within Greater Manchester, the homes that people need clearly won't entirely be delivered through the planning system, if I'm being perfectly honest with you, because as you rightly teased out, there are significant viability issues. Land prices, property prices are different here in Greater Manchester to London and the South East. And even within Greater Manchester, land values and property values differ from one local authority, and even within local authorities. But obviously the costs of materials and labour to build homes doesn't arguably vary significantly, I would say. So we do have a viability issue within Greater Manchester, and colleagues will probably remember the map we've produced through the Combined Authority, which looks at some of the programmes that Homes England marshal and have oversight on. And as you can see from the heat map, the areas in blue on there are only entitled to 20% of the funding that's available nationally to deal with issues like land remediation, infrastructure issues, and affordable housing. So, the government acknowledges itself in its own white paper that we've got a broken housing market. But actually how we deliver truly affordable housing is by the state, in my opinion, taking a much more active role and arguably moving beyond some of this green book appraisal, benefit cost ratio, treasury orchestrated stuff to genuinely build affordable houses in all parts of the country where there is clearly a need. Colleagues will know we have around 85,000 people on our housing waiting list within Greater Manchester. More than 92,000 homes have been purchased under right to buy. We know nationally approximately 40% of those find their way into the private rented sector. We have huge challenges in the housing market, but I'm often reminded of history, and it was after World War II when councils up and down the country were building council houses that homelessness was rendered statistically insignificant. So in many respects, what we need to do is get back to building truly affordable council houses. In my opinion, we need to put a pause on right to buy because we're losing so much stock within Greater Manchester, and we continue to do that. Much of that is not being replaced because of what I've illustrated here in terms of the funding formula. As we know, money goes back to the Treasury from homes purchased under right to buy. People accrue significant discounts. Some money stays within housing revenue accounts. But up until recently, there's been a cap on housing revenue accounts to prohibit and stop councils from actually building council houses. And then where is the real incentive? Because ultimately, right to buy has been further incentivised now. So whatever we build, people will be able to accrue a huge discount on a relatively new home if councils do start building councils in the near future. This is a real issue. We're doing what we can, I would say, at the moment within Greater Manchester. So you know we've taken a decision to use some of the profits and some of the charges we make on the £300 million housing investment fund within Greater Manchester, specifically to get into Greater Manchester more truly affordable housing. We think over the next 4 years that will generate about £12 million that will enable us to build some more affordable housing. But £12 million will go nowhere near, you know, meeting our housing need, which, you know, as it stands currently is around 85,000 people on our housing waiting list. So, you know, I guess my response to you is we need to continue to lobby government around all of this. Shelter recently undertook a cross-party commission looking at social housing and the future of social housing. What came out of that? This country needs 3.1 million social homes over the next 20 years. And as far as I'm concerned, it's government's job to support us in delivering that. And at the moment, they're not doing enough, nowhere near enough. But we are doing all we can, I believe, in Greater Manchester to do this.
I think that was a no. Councillor Birch, you said you had did you have other points to make? Can you make them all, just because yes. Otherwise Mayor Dennett will answer them all individually?
Thank you. Just a very quick and possibly not that significant point. For the last 4 years, I believe TFGM had bus passes for all that covered all the buses, and last year it disappeared. It only has for a yearly pass. It only has now just first bus company pass, yearly pass, and I'm thinking so many people are discouraged from actually taking public transport through that. Students, people who work, you know, in town. The question is, do we have any influence whatsoever on that, or that's completely out of our hands? Thank you.
So the answer to that last point is very little at present. So the arrangements that take place at the moment between bus companies are undertaken on a voluntary basis between the bus companies. We do have a seat at the table in the meetings of the collective that comes together to manage that agenda, but ultimately the level of ticketing that's made available is ultimately at the moment at the behest of the bus companies. Of course, that's one of the key elements that we are currently exploring for the Mayor and the Combined Authority through the review of the powers under the new Bus Services Act, and that's work that's underway at present. One of the key aspirations set out in the 24 strategy, reiterated in the delivery plan here, is for us to move to a fully integrated ticketing arrangement in Greater Manchester, and so that is what we are looking at the moment through the work that's underway.
I thought that was going to be the answer, but it was worth a try. Thank you.
I would have asked the Mayor had he been here, but as you're here, Simon, can you give us an update on timing of decisions about buses, please?
I can't today because there's still work underway to review where we find ourselves now and what that means with regard to a process which, as we've explained to the committee before, we are undertaking for the first time anywhere within the UK. But what I will do is take away for us to advise yourself, Chair, as to when we think we're able to bring that forward for you so that we can schedule it into the committee timetable.
Thank you. You're quite right. You and colleagues have brought that item and given us updates on that at this committee before. It is a big piece of work. We fully appreciate that. It is something that this committee is interested in, and we would welcome you and colleagues coming back in the future. Councillor Gunther.
Yes, Chair. First of all, can I congratulate Simon Warburton on his vast knowledge of transport, absolute expertise, but on the other hand, perhaps bring him back down to earth a little on more basic issues, and that is the current problem with buses, or rather lack of, and especially in rural areas. Are there any plans to improve this situation? Can he, I know perhaps this isn't the correct forum, but could you give me a contact where I can contact local bus companies and make my case, as it were? But I do congratulate you on your knowledge. I congratulate you on your ambitions for the transport system, but a bit more basic.
I think I'd clip that video from the webcast for your appraisal, Simon, but please go ahead.
Albeit, as you rightly point out, Chair, I am paid to do that. So. The answer at present is that there are real challenges. Members will have seen quite a degree of debate within local newspapers recently around the latest commercial withdrawals that we've seen across the bus network. As we touched on before, Greater Manchester is in a better position than other parts of the country in terms of the way in which we have managed to assemble the transport budget and retain a subsidised bus budget that is significantly greater than you would find in many other parts of the country. But we do have to take some very challenging decisions in terms of how far we can extend that subsidised bus budget. Again, it's one of the aspects that we're looking to explore fully through the review of powers under the Bus Services Act. In the interim, absolutely, we're really very keen to support local members in engaging with bus companies to look to encourage them to extend their ambitions wherever possible. So I'm happy to pick up with Councillor Gunter at the end to make sure that you've got the right contact details of members of our bus team who can help you to do that.
Councillor Walker.
Just going back to the very first submission, there is an issue about, as you say, going that way instead of that way in the expansion of property. And what I want some reassurance about, because after all our role is scrutiny, is that we know from our past that one of our biggest failures was our multi-storey blocks around the county. Every one of us, I'm guessing, had disasters of one sort or another, and we had to resolve them, sometimes by knocking them down, sometimes by taking drastic action or giving them to students or whatever. But I know that there's a demand for the £1 million fabulous flat, but that's less of a priority, I've got to be honest. I'm more interested in housing for the masses, but particularly stuff that's attractive, not something that you take because there's nothing else and as quickly as you can want to move on from there, and consequently don't live in it well, because that not living in it well starts the rot, and then the next people do the same. And I just want some sort of reassurance that we're clear about that issue, to stop that happening in the future, because I know in my patch we've knocked down, you know, multiple blocks of flats. And I know we have posh names for them now, but I still call them flats. And apartments doesn't cut it by calling them that. You know, it doesn't make any difference apart from making one or two people feel happier. But the other issue that I do notice, and it worries me a little, is that on some of our new developments where we've got our portion of affordable houses, they're very often flats. But they're not high rise, but they're 2- and 3-storey type flats. And if your politicians, as all the councillors in the room are, and you've knocked on a few doors, when you knock in those, you often find, not always, but you often find that they're the raggy end of the estate and that they are in danger of going that same way. They're a bit earlier in the process, and I just want some reassurance that we've learnt some solid lessons about this so that we don't just repeat what we did wrong in the 60s.
Hey, there's a lot in that, and obviously we're in a fairly uncertain environment at the moment because colleagues will be aware of the tragedy of Grenfell Tower and those people who tragically lost their lives, and obviously there's an ongoing public inquiry around all of that. We've also had the Hackett review that's been undertaken, the independent review of building regulations. Government has accepted the recommendations coming out of that, but what it's done is it's committed to further consultations about what that might mean for primary legislation around building regulations moving forward. So we've still not got absolute certainty at a national level about what all of this will mean. And then within all of that, obviously the fire safety order and how that will be implemented is also being considered through the public inquiry. So that will very much inform what happens in the future in terms of high-rise living. What I would say is a lot of what's coming through the planning system at the moment in terms of high-rise accommodation tends to be private high-rise accommodation rather than social housing or council housing. But I think, you know, you raise an important point about, you know, learning from the past. I mean, I actually live in a high-rise block in the city of Salford, which has recently undergone, you know, decent homes work, and, you know, new heating systems have been installed and insulation, bringing those blocks, if you like, into the 21st century, tackling fuel poverty, all those sorts of things. So there is an awful lot of learning in the system as it stands currently, because I think many of our councils have already been undertaking a lot of work to make our high-rise blocks actually decent on a number of levels. But for me, this isn't just about high-rise living, this is about genuinely meeting high-rise need. Genuinely meeting housing need, because as I said, you know, higher density in the urban core will help us in terms of not needing to release as much green belt. But it's not just about high-rise living, what we're talking about here. We're talking about higher density homes, townhouses, maybe supported accommodation, bungalows, all different forms of housing to genuinely meet the needs of the people of Greater Manchester. But I do think there's a lot of learning already in the system around high-rise living, absolutely. There's some uncertainty around what the building regs and the fire safety order will look like in the future after all of these pieces of work have been concluded. But I absolutely accept the point. I think for me, certainly thinking about my own local authority as well, one of the things we probably could have done better was kind of capital planning. So, you know, dealing with deterioration in terms of how we budget for, you know, those remediation costs of blocks rather than having to go cap in hand to the government all the time, or even worse, engaging in things like private finance initiatives. So, you know, I accept the point you're making, but I do think there is quite a lot of learning in the system as it stands currently. We're on a journey.
there is a lot of learning. We've learned in my borough as well. But the truth is that even though we've learned, today when I walk into some of our blocks and when I walk into some of the Salford blocks, where I've got a couple of friends living, I see a place I wouldn't like to live. You know, so that learning, you know, that learning started in the late 60s when we realised we'd got it wrong. In those days, it was the old Parker Morris standard. That was the only way you could build. And so I almost felt we had an excuse. And I know that sometimes with the price of land, sometimes that's the only way to build, but it shouldn't be for somewhere like Great. I understand it in London, and there's a different ethos, but whether we like it or not, in Greater Manchester, for most people, living in a high-rise block is something that you only want to do for a short time and that you want to move on. And I'm not sure that all, you know, those lessons, they've still not been... We learn every day. You know, I mean, we knew about the block in London before the Grenfell Tower block, but we didn't do anything. Every local authority I know, I think they're called Lineker, but I can't remember, something like that block in London and the fires there. Lacknell, that was it, Lacknell House. But we all knew about them, and it really feels like if we're not really absolutely clear on how we're going to manage these, they'll just continue with that same downward spiral, just a bit slower.
Thanks, Councillor Walker. Councillor Sharp, you were next on my list, please.
I think I've almost forgotten what I was going to say.
Shall I move on?
Yes. No. Okay. Just very, very quickly. I'm very grateful for your remarks regarding what I consider to be our 10 districts. And we're all very parochial when it comes to that. And we've got to learn that we're on here, that we're now part of the other 9 in each case, so we've all got different ideas. So I accept what you're saying, and the task is very difficult and individual for all of us. What I haven't heard from you, and I just would like to know, is the expression that's got into my vocabulary, and that is the powerhouse of the North. I haven't heard very much about opening up transport routes to people who are quite a long way away from us, but will come here to work and go back again with transport. So it's that sort of thing. It's not just HS2, which I've got running through my borough, and some people may have it through theirs, but it's bringing people in to commute. So do we have some strategy on that as well? Which is not going to happen immediately, I realise that. Thank you.
So, I mean, I can briefly give you certainly my comments on the powerhouse to the north, or the northern powerhouse, and I think Simon can respond specifically to some of the transport issues that you raise. I think at the start of the year, Greater Manchester obviously launched its vision for the next 20 years, and, you know, within that vision, we were absolutely clear that this is, in a sense, us playing our role in the north. I mean, we've already heard from Simon as well, Simon Noakes, on the work that's currently underway around the local industrial strategy. And if we are going to deliver an industrial strategy here in Greater Manchester, we have to be cognizant of our relationship with those other big cities and city regions ultimately on our doorstep. Because what we're talking about here is proper, robust economic and industrial planning. And that requires us to be, you know, playing to our strengths. What are our unique selling points? What are our industrial and economic advantages in the 21st century? And being able to do that properly, in my opinion, does require a detailed understanding of what else is happening in and around Greater Manchester, what's happening in Merseyside, what's happening over in Yorkshire. And you know, we've been clear as well, I think, in terms of the importance of infrastructure investment in the north. You know, we know that significant per capita infrastructure investment quite often goes into London and the southeast when you're comparing the north with the south. But a lot of that comes back to what I was trying to illustrate before about, you know, Treasury Green Book appraisal, benefit cost ratios, because growth tends to attract more of it in terms of public money, public capital and associated revenue. So, you know, we've certainly moved, I think, in terms of getting better at being able to articulate where it is we want to go over the next 20 years. Simon tells me that what we did at the start of the year landed really well with government. And, you know, they've chosen Greater Manchester as one of the 3 city regions within the whole of the country to actually implement local industrial strategy with. And those are ongoing conversations at the moment. So for me, the proof of the pudding is in the tasting, isn't it, really? So at the moment, everything feels quite positive in terms of the direction of travel. But ultimately, it will come down to, is the government investing significantly in our transport and infrastructure in the north, in Greater Manchester, and are they genuinely collaborating with us on how we develop our industry within a national context? At the moment, it feels positive, but again, we'll have to wait and see, I think, on all of this. But I don't know if you want to respond on infrastructure.
Probably quite briefly, really, Chair. So there is a very large body of work that we're involved in that's being led by Transport for the North to develop a full investment case for what's called Northern Powerhouse Rail, the east-west rail links. Transport for the North published its strategic transport plan for the North in the last few days, and I think we'd suggested to you, Chair, that you might find it useful if we brought a report on that to the committee so we can explain to you in the round how we're working with Transport for the North on those initiatives.
I think we'd welcome that as a committee, wouldn't we?
All I would say is get the Ordsall Court sorted out.
There we go, a plea for the Ordsall Court. Again, it wouldn't be a meeting of this committee unless the Ordsall Court was mentioned. Councillor Robinson, I think you were next on my list, please.
Thank you, Chair. Going back to the housing strategy again. As you talk, Paul, regarding the difference in value of land from one district to another, and where in Rochdale we are a victim of the fact that a lot of our house prices and land prices are lower than anywhere else. So we're a victim of people coming to Rochdale to take pieces of land and then hold on to them, hoping that prices will go up. But because it doesn't always go up, we are a victim of the council tax difference between one district and another. Because, say, London, a council tax down there would generate a lot of more income than, say, Rochdale because of the lower land value that we have up there. So those needs to be ironed out on a ratio that when we do build properties, we need to make sure they are we can get our share of the better houses so that we can get some income coming back through our council tax. But we are a victim at the moment because even Serco send all their people up to Rochdale because it's cheaper.
So just on council tax, colleagues in the room will know that in terms of council tax banding, that was fixed in 1991 and it's not changed since. So whatever's happened since 1991 hasn't actually had a direct impact on what happens with regards to the banding of properties for the purposes of council tax. I hear loud and clear what you're saying about differentials in terms of land value and property value. And I know that Rochdale are on with trying to, you know, regenerate your town centre to obviously build more homes and think about how you do high street regeneration, very similar to what Stockport are on with. And I suspect, you know, as a consequence of that, you'll start building more homes in higher, you know, council tax bandings, generating more income. But what I would say is, you know, the whole reason why we have something called a revenue support grant is to address some of these issues. You know, the revenue support grant exists for redistributive reasons. Unfortunately, over recent years, it's become highly politicised and governments seem more intent on using it as a mechanism to stuff money into Tory shires in the south of the country rather than supporting jobs and services in places like Rochdale. And we know, certainly through the work that Core Cities has undertaken, that the north generally has been disproportionately hit as a consequence of austerity and local government cuts and how that plays out. As has already been highlighted, we are entering a new spending review period for local government. Government has committed to a fair funding review. However, from what I'm seeing at the moment coming out of that, it doesn't look terribly fair when they're talking about things like negative RSG and more money going into rural districts and less money coming into, you know, urban districts like Greater Manchester in many respects. So, you know, obviously I'd encourage you to participate in all of those consultations that are being had at a national level, but I do hear loud and clear some of the inequities in the system. I would argue that the only way you're going to change some of that, though, is by a change of government. So.
And I think whichever government, getting rid of council tax, because it's a dreadful regressive tax that isn't fit for purpose. Councillor Clay, you were next on my list, please.
Thank you, Chair. So shall I do transport and housing separately, or do you want it all together?
Why don't you do it all together?
Okay. So just on the buses, it's a big issue where I am in Manchester. It's a big issue everywhere, no doubt. I think, obviously, a colleague from Bury's mentioned the problem in rural areas, and to me that's to do with the market-based approach to public transport. If it's based upon what's profitable, then you put the buses where you can make money. And I think we just have to accept that public transport needs to be run as a public service. Otherwise, you won't get that service where you need it in places like rural areas or in places like Manchester, where it's the east-west links across the city, which takes a lot of older people, less well-off people to their jobs or to hospitals across the city when they have to travel. You know, it's all very well to travel in and out of the city, and I think, you know, for yourselves, we're concerned about people getting across the city east-west. I'm sure between the different parts of cities and towns in Greater Manchester, people are concerned about those links, as well as just this kind of radial links into Manchester. There was an interesting comment from Jim McMahon about the First Bus franchise, and whether or not we could take that into ownership with the combined authority or TFGM or the councils in a consortium. I'll be interested to hear any thoughts on that. And there's also the question that when we talk about bus subsidies, you know, these are transport links that are essential for people who may have mobility issues, they may have, you know, lack of opportunities in their local areas. They don't drive because they don't have the money to drive. And there's a thought amongst some people in Manchester, certainly, that an over-preponderance on the cycle lanes budget at the expense of buses is detrimental in terms of the inequalities that exist already, and we need to be doing something to help people access bus services. Single ticketing, I'll mention. I've been to Berlin last summer. For €4.40, you can go anywhere across the Greater Berlin region for the day on any form of transport, and that map looks fantastic for the future. But if you're still stuck where you've got, oh, I've got the day saver from this company and the train ticket from the rail, and you know that's not going to work. So what we're doing about that? Glad you mentioned TransPennine electrification, because apparently that's going to deliver more for people in the north than the HS2 that people talk about. And I'll leave that there. Oh, I believe there's a conversation the mayors are involved in about scrappage schemes, and that's another big issue, because if we're going to bring in a sort of air pollution charge, which we need to do, that's going to disproportionately affect less well-off residents who can't afford to buy the new cars, and they're going to be disadvantaged by that. So I'll leave that there. Just on the housing, if I can, sorry, to continue.
There's quite a bit on transport, so I'm going to take back my earlier suggestion that we do everything together there. So on scrappage, it's diesel scrappage, I'm guessing you're talking about scrapping diesel cars. And just to add to Councillor Clay's comment about east-west travel across Manchester specifically, I guess the point you were making, is actually for the other boroughs, not everybody wants to go into Manchester Piccadilly, and sometimes we want to travel across our boroughs rather than just into the city centre. Yeah. So just addressing that together, please, Simon.
Certainly, thank you. Firstly, with regard to issues around public ownership, just to clarify for the committee, there is no provision, even within the new legislation, that's come forward for a model of public ownership. So we heard the comments that were made, but there is not a route for TFGM to pursue all the combined authority in that regard, regardless of what our view may be on that. But nonetheless, what we are looking to do, back to the comments that Councillor Birch raised before, we are looking to use those new powers to help to deliver the integrated ticketing that was talked about. So we already take the revenue risk for Metrolink, therefore we can set the Metrolink fares according to the risk that we're able to take, and what we want to be able to do is to put the right arrangements in place that allow us to remove those institutional barriers between the different forms of ticketing that Councillor Clay identifies is absolutely right. In terms of cycle lanes and buses, one of the things that we talk about in here, and something that we've been working very closely with Chris Boardman and his team on, is an initiative that we call Streets for All. So the point is well made. In principle, we can end up having a row, in effect, around the relative merits of modes on different parts of the highway. That's not really the right way to go about managing the highway in the city region. So through the Streets for All approach that we are developing, what we do is to take a collective view with all partners, local highway authorities and others, on the principal purpose of that particular part of the highway system, and then design a solution that works well in that regard. And one of the initiatives that we talk about in the delivery plan is the introduction of what we call quality bus transit, where we look to start to deliver some of the bus priority benefits that we've seen on the Leeds Salford Manchester busway, for example, through a Streets for All approach that works well for all road users. And that's a concept that we're going to look to bring forward through 2019, and I'll be able to brief the committee on further. With regard to the debate around scrappage schemes, yes, as Greater Manchester, we have been very clear that if through the work that we're undertaking at the moment, the Clean Air Plan requires the introduction of penalties for different types of vehicles, that there need to be arrangements in place that help the owners of those vehicles to shift across to compliant vehicles in advance of the introduction of penalties, and that would absolutely form a central part of the proposition. Where the Mayor is today is at a meeting that's been organised with mayors from across the UK, meeting with Secretary of State for Environment and Secretary of State for Health to try and help to co-design the right national toolkit and the right future legislation that means that we can bring forward our clean air plans in a consistent way across the country.
Go ahead and ask your housing ones, please.
Thank you, Chair. So obviously the change to the GMSF is, I think it's welcome that we're protecting the green belt. You know, I don't think anyone wants to concrete over everything. We're a relatively small country. We need to try and preserve some of that land for, recreational use and other things other than tarmac and big buildings. But when you're in Manchester, we have the problem where we are now going to have an increased burden, and I know that affects Salford and parts of Trafford as well, where we're trying to increase the number of high density developments we're going to have in this area. So that puts pressure upon services, and it puts pressure upon quality of life for people in the city centre area and the surrounding districts in Manchester, in Salford, in Trafford. So I guess the question is that what's the trade-off in order to ensure that those areas get the investment in the infrastructure they need, and that they get the support they need, so that we don't make this an unattractive place to live, because we need to protect our heritage, our architectural heritage and our cultural heritage as well, things like music venues and the atmosphere of the Northern Quarter, which brought a lot of business and a lot of people to the city. So there's a trade-off there where if you're just going to keep plonking more and more high-rise flats, and we all see them every time we go into city centre, we need to reduce that. And one thing in particular I'll be interested in is, in terms of land remediation, there's been some talk about funding to ensure that we can remediate land both in Manchester, Salford and the other central areas, but also for the boroughs so that they can use their brownfield sites. And I'd be interested to hear anything you've got on that, Paul. Also, the HIF money, you know, please do put it all into social housing, because we need the social housing. The 30,000 is a good target we want to get to, but we don't see them coming through to our planning applications at the moment, and you know, that's a job of work for the future. Finally, just on the environmental agenda again, passive house building, you know, are we going to have any sort of trials of that, any sort of schemes that can demonstrate that for the future? Retrofitting, is there going to be funds for retrofitting of older properties? And also modular building, if there's anything you could tell us about modular building proposals for the future, and maybe a joint venture to do it across GM. So
thank you, Councillor Clay. I'll remind those answering those questions that we're here till 12:30. So if the remarks on those interesting points, but numerous points, could be kept brief, I would appreciate it.
No, thank you very much, Councillor Clay. Given your questions, I think you illustrate the complexity of the situation, and I guess that's what I tried to do when I introduced the whole GMSF, because unless you're dealing with the complexity, you're not really dealing with reality. So, you know, I do thank you for your questions. In terms of the trade-offs with regards to doing urban density in our city regional core, the spatial framework, or the draft spatial framework, needs to be considered in line with everything else we're doing. So you'll be aware of the housing vision document, which is a precursor for a much more robust housing strategy for Greater Manchester. The same with our infrastructure framework as a precursor for an infrastructure strategy. But, you know, all of this needs to be also considered in line with your own local authorities' local plans or core strategies. And when you're talking about design and architecture and cultural protections, then I would expect that would be dealt with at a local plan level. So obviously, as a member of a local authority, you have an opportunity to be involved in shaping that and how that moves forward. But all of this needs to hang together, doesn't it, as one piece? For me, I'm really passionate about building truly affordable housing. And, you know, we've already made some progress, I think, with the Housing Investment Fund. And what we've committed to do in terms of that 12 million over 4 years is to use it for building truly affordable housing, tackling empty homes, so bringing them online within Greater Manchester, and also rogue landlords as well within Greater Manchester. So we've been really clear in terms of how that money is going to be used over the next 4 years. On retrofitting, this remains a perennial challenge. When I had the green portfolio, which Alex Ganotis now has within Greater Manchester, one of the key priorities were the retrofitting of existing stock. The big challenge is, where does the money come from to actually do that? You'll be aware that one of the first things that was scrapped when the current government came to power was housing market renewal, which was doing some of that work in terms of tackling non-decent stock in terms of what already exists. So moving forward, I think we do need a big conversation, and probably the best time to have that will be in the March Green Summit coming forward at the Lowry Theatre in Salford, because retrofitting is still there as a key priority in all the work that Councillor Ganotis is moving forward. On modular housing, the perennial frustration there has been, how do we aggregate land and how do we aggregate demand for housing? Because there's lots of kind of modular factories that have cropped up now in the north. I think one was opened only the other day in Merseyside by the Mayor of Liverpool. But the question is how do we collaborate as local authorities around land and demand to ensure we've got the supply of housing numbers to push through that modular route? And at the moment, I don't see as much collaboration across the 10 districts as probably I would like to see on modular, and I think that's something certainly for us to take away and work towards having, you know, much more collaboration around this. Are we going to fully embrace modular? Are we going to link it with all of our carbon ambitions and being carbon neutral, net zero carbons 2028, as I've already highlighted in my introduction? I think there's a real opportunity there, but we've got to be willing to collaborate around this. Otherwise, it just won't work. It won't stack up in terms of the finances and the business case, because it's all predicated on getting a significant number of through that route to be able to do that. So, thank you.
Okay, knowing that I was... Did you have something to add to that, Anne? Go ahead.
Just quickly going to add that the plan, I think, recognises, particularly on green infrastructure, that the biggest challenges are in our urban areas. That's where people have less access to green space, natural green space. And so we have got policies in there and talking about trying to, for the next version, come up with some standards that we can apply so that we can try to make sure we protect what we've got, particularly in the urban area, but also what the requirements will be for new development to actually make sure that new green space is provided as part of development. So we are trying to pick that up, and I think that is quite a change from the last version. And on the other side, the I say it every time, net zero carbon requirement by 2028 will force us on forced developers to start looking at things like passive house and how do we meet that requirement within a really quite short time scale. So we're hoping that actually having that ambitious target in there will force quite a lot of innovation, but we're also doing a lot of work with environment colleagues about what that might look like and with the Green Building Council.
Not often I got to trump you, Paul. I was just going to say that part of this issue will also be picked up in the local industrial strategy, because in that industrial strategy we are identifying the move to zero carbon by 2038 as being a key economic driver, as well as a kind of dealing with a lot of the social and environmental issues. So actually, if we're going to have a massive programme of retrofitting of homes, yes, we've got to find the money to fund that, and we're talking to government about that, but actually that can then lead to economic growth in terms of the work that needs to be done, and similarly in terms of the new forms of construction, in terms of modular, etc. So we're looking at the economic opportunities as well as tackling the social and environmental issues.
Just very quickly, there is a paper going to the Combined Authority on Friday on the latest round of housing infrastructure funding, and you'll be pleased to see Councillor Clay in there. There's some further work being done around Salford, Manchester and Bolton and Wigan there. We're basically applying for money that's available nationally to do things like land remediation, infrastructure, land assembly, all that sort of stuff that you talked about, because I was just mindful I didn't respond to that question. But paper on Friday going to the Combined Authority, hopefully leaders will agree that we're now through to the next round of conversations with government around all of that.
And just on the infrastructure strategy, industrial strategy, sorry, that went to one of the other scrutiny committees, Julie was telling me before, last week. And so it will be circulated to members of this committee for our information. It won't, I don't propose that it goes on an agenda, but for our information, because it links in with so many of the things we're talking about as well. Okay, a couple of questions from me. I asked residents who live in the ward I represent what they would like me to ask at this meeting, because we have a site in the ward I represent, fortunate enough to represent, which is one of the sites within the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework. It's Tangshut Fields, which in the plan is called Hyde Bank Meadows. So there were lots of site-specific questions, which this is not the right place for me necessarily to ask those. But I got 88 replies from people to an email I sent on Tuesday. And the four main categories were about infrastructure and about making the point that the infrastructure we currently have, particularly transport, but not only transport, isn't really coping with the number of people we've currently got. And specifically, that's really around the trains and the service people are currently getting at peak times around trains in Romiley, coming from Romiley to Piccadilly specifically, but also around roads and how the road capacity that we currently have is not fit for the number of people who are trying to travel around at peak times. Other areas were about affordable versus social, and I think we've addressed that already. Specific traffic hotspots, but also about protection of Greenbelt, because the site in the ward I represent is a playing field and a kids' play park that we're looking, or the plan is looking to put 250 homes on. Part of it is a playing field. And so I think probably my first question will be around, it's understandable that residents are really, really concerned about the impact on their lives of additional homes in the area when they feel the infrastructure we currently have isn't fit for purpose. And what would you say to them to convince them that this is the right plan for them and that there are plans in this plan, in this big plan, that will help make their lives better, not worse?
Certainly. So I think we've been acutely aware for a long time that the Romiley-Marple corridor is a corridor of movement which has grown significantly in terms of commuting through to the regional centre in particular. And I think if we look at logical employment movements through that corridor, that is only likely to continue to be the case. Long term, we see the tram-train solution that I talked about before, in particular, as absolutely fundamental element of infrastructure for growth within that corridor. Marple, from the outset, has been the corridor that we have described as a logical corridor for introducing tram-train operation, and there is more work that we have done on the concept through that corridor over the years than I think any other corridor in Greater Manchester. So we're in quite a strong place to be able to walk forward a case in that regard. What we do recognise, though, we talked about it before, is that tram-train is not going to come tomorrow. These are major infrastructure elements, and so what we are reviewing with government at the moment, and you'll have seen the recent media coverage of a couple of very positive engagements between the Mayor and the Secretary of State for Transport, is how might we be able to use the development of the Transport for the North rail model and the government's Williams review to develop more of a set of evolutionary stages through rail corridors like the Marple rail corridor. So we don't have to leap from where we are now to tram-train. We can move gradually to increased rolling stock capacity, and we will see increased rolling stock capacity coming through that corridor, to infrastructure improvements around the central hub that allow us to then look at frequency improvements through that corridor, and then a movement to tram-train. So fundamentally, that's stage one. Stage two, for that as an example, is how we strengthen the principal bus links through to Stockport Town Centre as well. And as part of the work that I talked about through Streets for All, that's something that we're looking at with the council at present. I am acutely aware that there are desires ultimately to see almost fixed track routes through from that part of the conurbation through to the town centre. The simple reality is that at present, within the funding scenario that we can envisage, we are going to struggle to be able to make such a case. But let's strengthen the public transport links through. And then we need to come back to some of the highways improvements which the council has talked about within that area, and how they might form part of an overall infrastructure plan within the area. But the absolute assurance that I could give to residents through that area, it is not an area where we have not been working intensively in terms of understanding its transport needs.
So that's good to hear. It's not dissimilar to things residents have been hearing for a while, though. Tram-train is not a new suggestion. Improving the road networks, not a new suggestion. I wonder if it would be useful to hear about phasing, so maybe looking at the way phasing is approached within the spatial framework and within the transport strategy, and about which order things will come. So will transport infrastructure come before housing developments come? Will new school places come before housing developments come? And that's a big concern for residents. I think I know the answer, but why don't you help me confirm that I know the answer?
I don't know whether Anne wants to comment, but there are policy statements that are made within the GMSF document about the relationship between us being able to secure public transport improvements and release of land. And I think those are policies that we're looking to try and pursue through the adoption of the framework.
Yes, we have set out as strongly as we believe we can, and we're looking to strengthen it at every stage. So any suggestions on how we do that, what residents say, and I do understand it, well, put the infrastructure in first and then we can have the housing. I think that is probably never ever going to happen. I think what we're all aiming for is that they happen at the same time, not that one goes in and infrastructure follows or never follows, which I think is the experience of people. We are doing work which Simon may want to come in on around infrastructure more broadly in GM, which is hoping to try to say how do we work with the system better, because the system doesn't work particularly well, and it's lots of different systems as well. But what we are trying to make it very, very clear through the policies and the plan, so the requirements for school places, the requirement for community facilities and the requirement for infrastructure, is that when developers look at these sites, they understand those requirements and that they are reflected in the land value. That's the first step we need to get to, so we don't then get into a discussion, we've paid too much for the land, we can't afford any of the infrastructure. So that's why we're trying to set out as clearly as we can what the expectation is for infrastructure, and that as clearly as we can, development should not come forward without commitment and funding for that infrastructure. It will be challenged and tested, and anything we can do to strengthen that between this stage and the next, we will be looking to do.
Thanks, Chair. It's not a site-specific point, but it's a longer-term point. As part of the local industrial strategy, we've had an independent prosperity review conducted of the Greater Manchester economy. So 6 world-leading economists have looked at the Greater Manchester economy and looked at the opportunities that we have in the economy and also some of the barriers to growth and to future inclusive growth and prosperity. They have identified infrastructure as one of those key barriers to growth, and they talk quite extensively about the infrastructure the impact infrastructure is having on the Greater Manchester's future economic prospects. So that will definitely feature within the local industrial strategy as one of the key things that we want to talk to government about how we get the right infrastructure in place for Greater Manchester, moving from a kind of building on Victorian infrastructure to actually delivering a 21st century infrastructure, low carbon infrastructure that we need for the kind of growth that we want to see achieved. So I just wanted to, as a kind of longer term answer, wanted to just reassure that that point about infrastructure and its role in driving inclusive growth is absolutely recognised by world leading economists. It will be reflected in the industrial strategy, and it is something we're actively talking to government about at the moment.
Councillor Walker, was it a specific point? Yeah. Please use your microphone.
It was just that point about making clear to developers about if you pay that much, you're still going to pay a whopping great lump of 106 money as well. And then, of course, you get into that. The trouble is that doesn't raise itself early in the exercise, and very often they madly go ahead with the planning application and they win it on appeal because it, as far as they're concerned, I mean, I was amazed by the theory that Bolton are going to be able to get away with doing 400 and odd houses, which was the point that was made earlier, because they're doing in Manchester and Salford, more development at the beginning, because my experience at Wigan of the number of appeals that we can't even make that argument across the borough. We can't say at that end of the borough there's a load of development going on, so you don't need it at this end, and that'll be enough for the housing supply. They don't accept that argument, and that's just across our borough. So I'm wondering, when it gets to appeal, it's this issue of when it gets to appeal that's, because otherwise it all falls down, doesn't it? It's no good having a great piece of paper that keeps on failing. No, but it isn't. You have to be realistic about all these things. So how realistic are we being about that proportioning? I mean, I'd like to explore in some more ways about how you make developers think sensibly about how, about the price of land, because obviously the person selling the land, all he's interested in is this theoretical profit on the land.
Okay. Thanks, Councillor Walker. Anne, you were looking like you wanted to come in on this.
would like to say I don't think that I have claimed that I can make developers think sensibly about price, but I think...
No, I realise that, yeah.
But I think your point about Section 106 and requirements coming up too late in the process is the real problem. So a developer can argue, you've only just told me this is what I need to do, I've already bought the land. We're actually saying, before you even think about buying the land, this is what the expectation will be on this site. And I think that is quite valuable. We don't manage to do that in every case, which is why I think that argument can be made that somebody didn't know this is what they were going to be required to do. In terms of the 5-year supply, it will be one of the biggest challenges of bringing brownfield land forward at the rate that we say we're going to bring it forward is very difficult, but we are being as realistic as we can based on the information we have about the land supply and the markets in your areas to say this is the level of house building we think we can deliver over the first 5 years and the next 10 years. If we are doing that, if we're building at that rate, we are quite safe. That, you know, the 5-year supply is a very blunt tool that is used, I think, against us, but actually if we're demonstrating a 5-year supply of housing, it's quite a strong tool for us to then be able to use to resist other development. It's the best we can do, but actually this plan will do nothing other than set out that proposal. We are reliant on people like Steve and others to be, you know, having those discussions and getting the funding for remediation, getting brownfield land and accelerated delivery. So everything we're doing has to work together to make this work. This just sets a framework, but actually bringing the land forward is the biggest prize for all of us, really.
Councillor Walker, I'm going to move us on, Councillor Walker, because we've heard it, we're running up against time. Councillor Brownridge, please.
Thank you very much. Really, just to pick up Councillor Robinson's point, because obviously Oldham's in the same position. We're probably in the worst position because we don't have a business rate base either, and we have a huge shortage of land for us to actually put up new houses to address that. We also know that revenue support grant is being slashed, and we expect it to be zero within the next few years. They're talking about taking the disadvantage element out of the funding stream altogether. We also have low property values. We had 2 applications went to committee last night with no social housing provision whatsoever because it wasn't viable. So even though we've got low property values and land values, it's still not viable. So getting that mix is a dilemma that we have to address on a Greater Manchester-wide basis. The other point I just wanted to pick up was about brownfield, because obviously we all committed to brownfield. The problem we have is most of our brownfield is in the parts of the boroughs that are already incredibly built up and have no environmental quality whatsoever, coupled with the point you make in the housing strategy that a lot of the old housing is way past its sell-by date and really needs pulling down because the houses themselves aren't fit and the environment people are living in isn't fit. And I note all the comments we've had today rely on the government giving us money. And I'd hesitate to mention the B word, but the whole concept of economy and budgeting and money in these countries, God knows where it is with the Brexit dilemma and debacle that's happening. So I suppose the question is, we are a very wealthy, potentially wealthy area. What can we do to actually be self-funding so we can tell the government to sod off? Because they're not interested in us, are they? They've made that very clear. So what can we do to actually build up our own financial base to be able to do some of this? Because we've got some really innovative working going on here, you know, our place-based initiatives, partnership working. We've really bucked the trend, I think. So can we not be even more ambitious? Can we not borrow money from Europe? Because, I mean, they'll be anxious to help us, won't they? No? But, yeah. Is there something we can do to make ourselves independent of government? Because we don't have a government at the moment. They're not addressing any of these major issues that are affecting the country, but the north of England, we know, as Paul's already said, that northern, particularly Labour authorities have been Oldham, 6th worst hit council in the country. And I mean, we have major problems, and we're doing a good job. You know, we should be building on all that initiative and the brilliant brains that are thinking of alternatives. But I think we really need to push for thinking, what can we do more as a very collective, and with Manchester, and with Merseyside, and with Greater Yorkshire. You know, we've got a bigger economy than some European countries there, haven't we, potentially? Can we do more to build on that, please?
This is sounding like the preamble to a manifesto for Nexit or something, where the North just casts ourselves off from the South. But it would be remiss of me not to point out my European Union pen as the only Liberal Democrat in the room. Mayor Dennett, go ahead.
Councillor Brownridge, I think your question goes to the nub and the heart of the complexity of the system and how it isn't actually working in favour of all of the great stuff we're actually doing in Greater Manchester. You're absolutely right. Is there another way? I actually think there is. And we're starting to see the semblance of that through things like inclusive growth and what that means and how that then translates into practice within our districts and Greater Manchester. Social value, looking at, employment standards, looking at making sure we maximise public procurement in terms of working with businesses and people who live within Greater Manchester, trying to keep the Greater Manchester pound within Greater Manchester. And, going beyond all of that, I think there's a big conversation to be had by what do we mean by an inclusive economy within Greater Manchester? Because it's not just about growth. What does an inclusive economy look like if we potentially don't have growth or don't have growth at the level we've seen over recent years? And I guess this takes me to what's being talked about an awful lot at the moment around new municipalism. I don't know if you've come across this, but the idea that we use our assets, be they land, be they borrowing powers, because local authorities can borrow from Public Works Loans Board at a relatively low interest rate, to actually think about how do we create value here to almost offset our dependency on central governments. Because despite the rhetoric around devolution and self-empowerment, the reality is, we've become more centralised over recent years, certainly in terms of resources. Yes, we can make more decisions locally, but unless you actually have the money, the resources, the people, the ability to deliver on that, you're absolutely right. It's just weasel words in many respects. I do think there is a lot more thinking for the city region to do in this space in terms of, how do we collaborate around this agenda? How does the spatial framework support places like Oldham? How do we genuinely redistribute growth? How does infrastructure funding money come to you? Because there is a huge problem there. What I've tried to illustrate in terms of the north and south issues in terms of Green Book appraisal, benefit cost ratio. When you start looking at Greater Manchester, it's exactly the same. The south probably would get the money from government, that 20% I was talking about, because you've got the homes there, you've got the employment there. When you run that through the Green Book appraisal, the benefit cost ratio, it ticks a box. We then can download some of that capital that's available. Doing that in some of the northern local authorities, really, really difficult. And, look at the paper that's going to the combined authority on Friday and look at the authorities that potentially will benefit from the next round of infrastructure funding. It's predominantly Manchester, Salford and Bolton and Wigan as well. Look like they're going to benefit from it if they pursue that and are successful with it. But I hear loud and clear, this is a complex issue. Where government are going on fair funding, goodness only knows. I mean, they've been quite explicit. They want local authorities to be self-financing in the future. So I do think you're right. You're setting down a clear challenge about how do we as a system here in Greater Manchester try and offset all of this complexity, this madness in many respects, if we're being actually quite frank about it, to determine a future for ourselves. And I think we're in a really strong position because at the start of this year, we articulated a vision for Greater Manchester for the next 20 years. I think we need to quickly get into that space of how do we deliver this in a way that doesn't increase the dependency on central government and actually plays to some of our assets, our strengths, and our partnership working within Greater Manchester. Absolutely fantastic question.
But it's okay because we've taken back all that control. So we're finding it really easy. Okay, two final questions from me. One is about the interaction between the boroughs. So looking at some of the sites that are in the spatial framework, some of those are on borough boundaries, and so obviously will have an impact on the neighbouring borough. The way the consultation is working, so if you go online, you're asked all the questions, you can answer as many of them as you like. But in terms of information sessions within boroughs and work being done to make sure residents are aware of things and being encouraged to participate in things. I wonder if you could just say a word on that. Clearly, from my point of view, I'm thinking about the impact on Bredbury, Woodley and G Cross, and thinking about that impact on Hyde Road and Stockport Road as an example. I'm sure there are other examples in other boroughs. And then just a question on the consultation. You talked right at the beginning about the number of responses that were received to the first draft of the spatial framework. And I'm imagining you're expecting a number of responses. Some will already be in. Yes? 1,600 in so far. You're expecting a number of responses. That's a big piece of work to look at those and to process those. I wonder if you could talk about how they are processed and how they influence the next and final, I think if I understand correctly, the next draft is hoped to be the final draft. Although Anne didn't look delighted at the thought there, just, yeah, great, well, final. The next draft, how those consultation responses are brought into that draft and how they're incorporated in that.
The cross-boundary issue is an interesting one. We've got a couple of, three big cross-boundary sites in Oldham, Rochdale and Bury, which we have identified as cross-boundary, and we have had some cross-boundary events, I think. Actually, you're right in terms of some of the others that are not cross-boundary because they're wholly within one district, but they do have quite an impact on the others. That consultation, I think, has been organised around the district where those sites are in. Has this come up? This hasn't come back to me as an issue. Is this coming up with your residents that actually we should be having events or information at events in? Well, it actually would be in Tameside about Bredbury because it impacts on Bredbury, or what's the actual?
From our perspective, we've asked for some of the consultations to make sure that there are people in the room. So there's an officer from Tameside in the room because everybody will use the same road to get to the motorway. Everybody's going to use either Woodley or Bredbury station. So it's to make sure there's somebody in the room that can answer questions because most residents don't look at borough boundaries and never leave the borough that they're in.
How strange. So are you asking, is that something you want us to actually be bringing up and making sure that we are speaking to districts about, or are you saying that you've asked for that and it's happening, or you've asked for that and it's not happening?
No, our officers are very good in Stockport and are responding to our requests. It wasn't something, I think we had to request it, and I just wonder if that's something that could be looked at just to make sure that people are aware that the world doesn't start and end with their own borough boundary.
Noted. In terms of the consultation, we are expecting, I think, probably a similar level of response. So we normally get all of the responses at the end. So the fact that we're halfway through and have 1,600, that's actually higher than we normally have. But I do think we'll get a lot more responses as we move through. What we will do, we've got a team of people that we are assembling from the district. So every district has volunteered one person who will be coming to work, which will be interesting given our desk situation in here at the moment. But coming into work from week 6, they will start to come in. So we're in week 4 now, we're expecting to get a lot more responses sort of over the next 4 weeks. And we've also got some temporary staff in who are doing a lot of the admin work, particularly around when we get letters, they're copy typing them in. So although we've been trying to encourage people to do it online, we are still getting some letters, and we know we still will continue to get letters. We're hoping then, because we're starting, I mean, we're starting now, so the 1,600 we have, we're starting to process by actually at least acknowledging where they are and what the issues that are coming out of those. And within 3 months to have looked by theme and then by site at what the main issues coming out are, and then discussing those with districts and with people who are in the central team looking to revise the plan. And what we did this time, which I think probably was not the best thing to do, we've got a report that says this is what everybody said last time, and then we produced topic papers that actually summarised what people said and showed how we're taken into account. From some of the questions I've had from people, I think they want to see more specifically how, you know, we said you did, this is what we said, how have you responded? And we can't do that individually. We'll not be responding to people individually, but I think by theme we will say Cherry Tree Lane, which is coming out as quite a big issue. You know, lots of people commented on this. These were the main things they said. This is how they've been taken on board. This is what the next plan says about them. So we'll be trying to be clearer for people what their comments were and how they've been taken on board, and if they haven't been taken on board, what the reasons for that are. It is quite a monumental task, but it's much easier, I think, if we do it as we're doing it now, which is as we go along. Last time, we were out just doing all the events and then just looked at 27,000 responses, including 16,000 letters at the end of the consultation, and had to deal with all of those. So we've got a much more structured approach. But what we will provide for people and feedback from you, particularly from comments you might be getting from residents about what people would find useful, how they, you know, I think we do have to tell them they'll not get an individual response, but what is it that they need to see to actually, I think, reassure them we've read their comment and we've received it and we know about it, and then how that has helped to influence the next stage of the plan would be helpful.
You told me a few minutes ago that you had something else to say. I'm going to draw us to a conclusion.
Sure. No. Thank you, Chair. It was in response really to some of the questions that you raised off the back of the 88 replies you'd received from residents in Stockport. And I guess for me, I did say at the start, you know, the real benefit of us collaborating around this agenda is we can achieve so many things together, and I do genuinely believe that. We've already heard about, you know, phasing in our local housing need numbers across the city region. And, you know, I know Stockport is one of the prime beneficiaries as a local authority in terms of you meeting your housing need by collaborating with the other 9 local authorities in Greater Manchester. So there is a clear benefit to Stockport in terms of you reducing the need to release more greenbelt through collaborating with Greater Manchester. But I think there's also a broader point, and we've heard an awful lot today about some of the challenges around how we finance infrastructure moving forward. Having a vision, having a plan, and having a strategy makes it so much easier when you're trying to make the case and lobby government for more investment in Greater Manchester. So for me, there's a clear benefit there. We will continue on this brownfield preference agenda. The town centre challenge very much speaks to that, and it also speaks to lots of other agendas about the importance of leisure, culture, green space, green infrastructure, tackling health inequalities, getting people living much more active lifestyles in terms of walking and cycling and enjoying that public realm. But, you know, to do this together and jointly as a city region is a really powerful thing. We mustn't underestimate that. And we're the only city region outside of Greater London to actually be engaging in proper, robust strategic planning. The spatial framework is, you know, a continuing conversation, and we genuinely do want people's input and engagement. But as I said at the start, all of this work mustn't be considered in isolation from all the other great stuff which will bolt on to this to create a proper, robust strategy for Greater Manchester. I do genuinely feel this is a radical redraft, but I also think operationally we're thinking about the interconnectedness now of different pieces of work, and we're not thinking about things in siloed ways. And that puts us in a really strong place moving forward to deliver on the vision and the ambition that we've set ourselves here in Greater Manchester. So I commend all of this to you all.
Okay, quick reminder for the dozens of residents who'll be watching this webcast, the best way for them to input is via the gmconsult.org website, which is the consultation portal. I think that's right. And we would encourage as many people as have views to contribute in that way. Good to hear Cherry Tree Lane getting a name check. Thank you, Anne. Okay, work programme. I'm going to invite Julie just to comment on the work programme, which is item 7.
Thank you, Chair. The meeting on the 14th of March, we've got a number of things listed there. The waste strategy, the drafting of that, won't be ready, primarily because the government have delayed publishing the national strategy till December. And DEFRA haven't yet launched the consultation, and there could be further delays caused by Brexit. So we're thinking that the waste strategy may not come back till May or June time. So that's not there. The housing strategy, we understand, could potentially come to April. So that shifted. The Clean Air OBC, we had that last time, and as was mentioned earlier, that is primarily an item for district scrutinies. So suggesting, if it's agreed, that we can circulate something for information, but the Clean Air OBC will be taken through your district scrutinies, because it's for your execs and councils to take the decision. So that leaves the green work and low carbon, and as we head towards the Green Summit on the 25th of March, Mark Atherton wants to come back to the committee to present a suite of documents around low carbon and the green agenda, including smart energy, etc., on the 14th of March, so that it's in good time for you all to contribute towards all of those planning before the Green Summit and before the whole thing goes back to the CA at the end of March. So that leaves us with the item on future innovation in transport, which was a look at potential opportunities. So that's something the committee's asked to be done, and we've got 3 external independent people lined up who can come and have a conversation around that, and the green and low carbon stuff as 2 substantive items for March. And then for April, the GM strategy 6-monthly usual review of where we are with that, and the housing strategy, and then we'll bring the waste strategy to you when we can, if that's okay.
Lovely. Thanks very much for that, Julie. That's a useful update. For the next meeting then, we're doing something slightly different, because often we receive reports from officers and we scrutinise them and comment and question and so on. At the next meeting, we've got some people who are not employed by TFGM or the Combined Authority in a shock to our system, which I think can only be a good thing. They're people, some of them are academics, and they're going to come and talk to us, and we're going to question them about future innovations in transport. So I'd love it if the committee had a think between now and then about the sorts of questions they might find useful to be answered. Because in 40 years' time, nobody thinks we're going to be travelling in the same way that we're travelling in now. And I think we need to, it could be jetpacks, it could, who knows? It's unlikely to be jetpacks. But please do have a think about the sorts of questions you would like to be answered. So that's for next time. Okay, thanks for that, Julie. Items 8 to 11, sorry, Councillor Gunther, is it jetpack related?
Chairman, just if I can just say, Chairman, as things stand at the moment, I'm unlikely to be able to make the March meeting, so I would like to extend my apologies now. If I can change things, I will.
Duly noted. Thank you very much for that. So items 8 to 11 really are just for our information. They're for noting. Nobody's indicating that they have anything particular to say. So our next meeting is on Thursday, the 14th of March in this room at 6 p.m. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.